There's a sound that used to echo through empty industrial parks after midnight. Not the roar of a finely tuned racing engine, not the polished growl you'd hear at a car show. It was rougher than that. A little uneven. A carbureted cough followed by a sudden, screaming pull as a cheap V8 wound itself out under a hood that didn't quite close right anymore. If you grew up in America in the mid-1980s, you knew that sound. You might have made it yourself, in a parking lot behind a shuttered factory, waiting for someone to drop their hand and shout go. This is the story of how an economy car saved American horsepower. How a generation of teenagers, broken, restless and living in the shadow of a muscle car era they'd only seen in magazines, found a loophole nobody expected. And how, for about a decade, empty bypass roads and abandoned industrial lots became the last great proving ground for American speed before the whole thing quietly came to an end. To understand why any of this mattered, you have to understand just how bad things had gotten. By 1980, the muscle car was not just fading. It was, by most accounts, dead and buried. The engines that had once produced 400, 500 horsepower in the late 60s were now choking on early emissions equipment that nobody had figured out how to make work properly. Catalytic converters strangled exhaust flow. Compression ratios got slashed to survive on unleaded gas. A Mustang in 1980 might carry a 302 cubic inch V8 under the hood, the same basic engine family that once powered legends, and squeeze out barely 120 horsepower. Grown men who remembered the glory days would pop the hood, look at the smog pump and the vacuum line strangling the intake, and just shake their heads. The performance car, as an idea, felt like something America used to be good at. Past tense, and then something small happened, something that barely made headlines at the time. Ford, chasing better fuel economy and lighter weight across the entire lineup, put the Mustang on a new, smaller platform. They called it the Fox platform, after the internal code name, and the resulting car became known forever after simply as the Fox Body. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even particularly popular at first. It looked boxy and plain next to the swooping lines of the muscle cars a decade earlier. But it was light. Really light. And that detail, more than anything else, is what set the next 10 years in motion. Because while the emissions regulations of the era were strangling horsepower everywhere, engineers were also quietly solving a different problem. Carburetors, the fuel mixing devices that had powered American cars for the better part of a century, were clumsy and imprecise, hard to tune for both power and cleanliness at the same time. But by the mid-80s, electronic fuel injection had matured enough to become standard equipment, and it changed everything. Fuel injection let engineers meter gasoline with a precision no carburetor could match. It meant an engine could actually produce real power again while still passing emissions tests. In 1987, Ford dropped a fuel-injected 5-liter V8 into the Fox Body Mustang and something clicked back into place that had been missing for the better part of a decade. The car wasn't fast by today's standards. 225 horsepower, if you're keeping track, which sounds almost quaint now. But paired with a car that weighed barely 3,000 pounds, it was fast enough. Fast enough to embarrass cars that cost twice as much. And crucially, fast enough to feel like something had been returned to American teenagers that they'd been told, their whole lives, no longer existed. Here's the part that really mattered, though, the part that turned a decent factory car into a full-blown subculture. The Fox Body Mustang was cheap. Genuinely, accessibly cheap, the kind of car a kid working a summer job at a gas station or a fast food counter could actually save up for and buy outright, or finance on a used car lot without a cosigner. And once you had one in your driveway, it turned out to be almost absurdly easy to make faster. The engine bay was simple, roomy, uncomplicated by the layers of computer-controlled complexity that would come to define cars just a decade later. A teenager with a socket set, a copy of a mail-order parts catalog, and a Saturday afternoon could swap in a better intake manifold, add long tube headers, drop in a set of gears, and feel the difference immediately. There was an entire aftermarket industry springing up almost overnight to feed this hunger. Mail-order companies shipping cams and carburetor spacers and cold air intakes to kids in small towns who'd never so much as have dreamed of affording a factory muscle car new off the lot a generation earlier. It wasn't just Ford, either. Up in Flint, Michigan, Buick was quietly building something almost stranger and, in its own way, even more menacing. The Grand National. A mid-size coupe wrapped entirely in matte black, with a turbocharged V6 under the hood instead of a V8, which sounds like it shouldn't have worked, and yet it did. By 1987, the top version, the one they called the GNX, could outrun a Ferrari in a straight line. It became the boogeyman of the street racing world, the car that looked like a funeral procession and drove like a dragster, the one that would roll up next to some kid's proud Mustang at a red light and simply disappear into the distance before he'd even finished revving his engine. The rivalry between Mustang owners and Grand National owners became the defining feud of an entire generation of American car culture, argued over at gas stations and drive-in restaurants and in the pages of car magazines that treated the debate with the seriousness of a heavyweight title fight. And so, all across the country, in places that had absolutely nothing to do with each other, the same scene started playing out. Newly built industrial parks, the kind of sprawling, half-finished business complexes going up on the edges of American cities and suburbs in the go-go economy of the 80s, sat empty and quiet after 5 o'clock. Long, straight stretches of freshly paved road, no traffic lights, no pedestrians, sometimes not even finished with lane markings yet. Perfect, in other words, for exactly the purpose teenagers would inevitably put them to. Add in the old highway bypass roads that had been left behind when new interstates rerouted through traffic elsewhere, roads that used to carry thousands of cars a day and now carried almost nobody after dark, and you had a whole hidden geography of racing spots stitched across the American landscape, known only by word of mouth, passed from one graduating class of gearheads to the next. It happened late at night, almost always. Word would spread through a phone tree, or later, this was the analog age still mostly running on landlines and gas station pay phones, someone would mention it at a drive-in or a mall parking lot where kids gathered on a Friday night, and by 11 or midnight a small crowd would start filtering in. Mustangs. Camaros. The occasional Grand National, treated with the kind of nervous respect usually reserved for something dangerous. Headlights lining up along the edges of the road, engines idling roughly in the cool night air, someone standing between two cars with a flashlight or just their bare hands, waiting for the signal. It wasn't polished. It wasn't sanctioned. There were no trophies, no sponsorships, no cameras beyond somebody's camcorder capturing shaky footage that would circulate on VHS tapes among friends. What was on the line was pride, a few crumpled $20 bills sometimes, and bragging rights that would last exactly until somebody else showed up with a faster car. It was reckless, and it's worth saying plainly that it was dangerous, the kind of thing that ended badly for some people and some families in ways that never made it into the nostalgic retelling. But it was also, in its own rough way, deeply democratic. This wasn't a world of trust fund kids and imported exotics. This was working-class America, kids who spent their after-school hours turning wrenches instead of doing homework, who understood torque curves and gear ratios better than they understood algebra, who found in a 5-liter Mustang something that felt, for the first time in their lives, genuinely theirs. A cheap car, made fast by their own hands, on roads nobody else wanted. For about a decade, that world held together. But like most underground scenes built on a loophole, it was always going to have an expiration date, and the closing of that loophole arrived from several directions at once, almost as if the universe had finally noticed what was happening and decided, collectively, to shut it down. The first blow came from Detroit itself, or more precisely, from the federal regulators shaping what Detroit was allowed to build. In 1996, a new emissions and diagnostic standard became mandatory across the American auto industry, one that everybody in the business simply called OBD-II. On paper, it sounds bone dry, a standardized system of onboard computers monitoring engine performance and emissions in real time. In practice, it was the end of an era. Cars built after this point were wrapped in layers of computer control that made the old approach to backyard tuning essentially obsolete. You couldn't just swap a carburetor or bolt on a set of headers and expect the car to run right anymore, not without understanding software, sensors, and factory-programmed parameters that a kid with a socket set in his parents' garage simply had no access to. The barrier to entry, once a summer job and a mail-order catalog, was suddenly a level of technical expertise that shut most teenagers out entirely. At the same time, the streets themselves were closing up. Cities and states across the country, tired of the noise complaints and the very real body count that street racing had quietly accumulated over the years, started passing aggressive new laws. Vehicle impoundment statutes let police seize a car on the spot, sometimes permanently, for racing or even for spectating. Fines climbed. Insurance companies got wise to the pattern of young men with modified V8 Mustangs and started charging premiums that made ownership genuinely difficult for a working-class teenager. The industrial parks that once sat conveniently empty after dark filled in with new tenants, new security patrols, new fences. The old bypass roads, quiet for years, got noticed by local police departments running their own late-night patrols specifically looking for exactly this kind of gathering. And then, almost as if to put a period on the whole sentence, Hollywood turned its attention elsewhere. In the year 2001, a movie called The Fast and the Furious hit theaters, and it reshaped what an entire new generation of American teenagers pictured when they imagined street racing. Gone were the muscle cars and the industrial parks of the Midwest and the South. In their place came sleek, neon-lit Japanese imports, tuner culture, nitrous oxide, and a visual language that felt urban and futuristic instead of gritty and blue-collar. It wasn't fair, exactly, to the Mustangs and Grand Nationals that had defined the previous decade, but culture rarely is fair. Within a few years, the cultural center of gravity for street racing had shifted almost entirely, and the old Fox Body scene, the one built on cheap V8s and empty industrial roads, faded into something that felt, almost overnight, like it belonged to a different America entirely. What's left of it now mostly survives in memory, in the occasional weathered Fox Body Mustang still parked in a driveway somewhere, a labor of love kept running by someone who was there the first time around. It survives in old photographs, grainy and slightly overexposed, of teenagers leaning against cars in industrial park parking lots that don't exist in the same form anymore. It survives in the stories fathers tell their kids, usually with a little more polish and a little less honesty about how dangerous it actually was, about the night their 5-liter beat a Camaro by half a car length on a road that's probably a strip mall parking lot today. For about 10 years, a cheap, boxy little Ford and its dark, brooding rival out of Flint, Michigan gave American teenagers something the previous generation had been told was gone for good. Real horsepower, real speed, and a place, however unofficial and however temporary, to prove it. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, changing technology, changing laws, and a changing culture closed that window for good. It's a very American kind of story, in the end. A brief golden age, built on a loophole nobody planned for, gone the moment the world caught up.